I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists.
Please welcome demographer and Wonderfest Science Envoy, Chris Soria.
Hi everybody. As Tucker said, my name is Chris Soria. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Demography at UC Berkeley. And usually my presentations are geared towards an academic audience, which means that they usually will get straight to the point. There'll be very little story to it. But I was told that it would be best if I structured this presentation as an unfolding narrative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the story of how this research came about. I also added a little progress bar here at the bottom. So this is going to indicate how far along we are in the story, which I think is helpful so that you know how much longer you have to listen to me. So the story actually starts here. So just to give you some context on this research, I'm presenting here COVID cases over time in the United States, otherwise known as incidents. So this big blue bar here is pointing to where the story of this research journey starts with demographers Dennis Fian and Aisha Mahmoud, who started collecting data in the early months of the pandemic to better help us understand people's contact patterns. And so given that COVID spreads through close interpersonal contacts, this type of real-time research was actually really important for helping us understand the spread of disease and how wide it would spread. And so they ended up collecting information on just over 19,000 people in a nationally representative sample, and there was also some city-specific samples there as well. And they called it the Berkeley Interpersonal Contact Study, otherwise known as BICS. And because they wanted to see behavior over time, they collected data over different stages of the pandemic at different time points, ranging from April 2020 to May 2021, when pandemic was starting to, the first phase of the pandemic was starting to settle down a bit. And so the 6 waves are presented here in this plot. On the x-axis, on the x-axis are the time points when the data was collected. And I also added a few key events here so that we can get some further context into when the data was collected. So for example, in the second wave here, is when COVID-19 deaths surpassed 100,000. And then the last wave here, right before the last wave, is when vaccines became accessible to the public. And so the data has been able to capture a lot of different phases of the pandemic. And just to be clear, this is not what's called a longitudinal study where you're collecting information on the same people over time. This is a series of cross sections, which means that you're collecting data on different people over time. And so this is where I entered the picture in 2024, along with Professor Audrey Dora-Land, who at the time was at the University of Minnesota. Now she's at the University of Washington. So we all got together. We brainstormed some interesting questions that we could answer of their data. And it just so happened that we were all interested in partisanship, and we noticed that partisanship was becoming increasingly important. And so we thought that we began to do what's called a literature review, which is essentially a thorough reading of all of the research, or not all the research, but as much as we can get on a given topic so that we can find out how much is known and what is not known. In this case, about partisan attitudes and behaviors around science and disease. And so what we found was that there was a lot known about partisanship throughout the pandemic. It's a very thoroughly researched topic, but there's still some big unknowns. So what we found was that, for example, it's very well known that political polarization in this country is bad and has been getting bad long before the pandemic. So in this figure by Pew Research, we see that ideologically, Republicans and Democrats there was some difference between them, but there was a lot of overlap as well. And by the time we get to 2014, you see that they start to diverge. The gap between them it increases. And more recent research shows that things are not getting better here. We see that Republicans and Democrats are becoming more hostile towards one another. So in this poll that's been running since 1994 by Pew Research again, we see that the percentage of Republicans who view the opposite party as very unfavorable has increased from 21% to 62% in just 2 decades. About 90% of Democrats in this poll said that they perceive Republicans as being at least unfavorable. And so more worryingly and more relevant to this research topic, however, is that we see that Republicans and Democrats are differing in their perception of science. So other Pew Research polling shows that Republicans are generally becoming more skeptical of the scientific method. In 2019, only 55% of them said that the scientific method, quote, generally produces accurate conclusions, whereas 70% of Democrats said the same. Only 26% of Republicans said that scientists are, quote, better than others at making decisions on scientific policy. This is compared to 58% of Democrats. Oh, whoops. Right here in this bottom or right plot. In other words, belief in science itself is becoming a partisan issue. And so this is also a gap that has been increasing over time. And this matters because distrust in science also impacts whether people are likely to listen to scientists when it comes to health behaviors. So for example, even back in 2015, when the H1N1 bird flu epidemic was going around, you already see that Republicans are much less likely to get vaccinated. So in this plot here, we see that in the early 2000s, Democrats and Republicans were actually about the same in terms of their willingness to get vaccinated. And it was, there's some research that shows that it was after 2008, right when the economy was collapsing, when we really see Republicans and Democrats start to diverge. Oh, and I forgot to mention that if anybody has any questions or if something's not clear, feel free to interrupt me.
When you were asking people about science, was it talked about how they define science? Were you talking about gravity or social sciences?
Can you repeat the question? Or what?
Yeah, so the question is, and this is actually, this is still what's called the literature review. So this is still my review of other people's research so that we can find out what we know and what we don't know. But the question is, when Pew Research conducted these polls, did they define what science is? And I think the assumption there is that there is a lot of variation in what some people consider science and what some people don't. So like, for example, some people will consider demography to not be a science, and some people will. This particular research, this particular poll did not go into the specifics of what science is, and so it left it up to the respondent to fill in the gap of what they define as science. So that's a very good point. So that it could be that there's different groups. That it could be that Republicans are including the social sciences, and maybe they're more skeptical of the sciences more broadly, whereas the Democrats have a much more narrow definition of science. I think the fact that you're seeing Republicans maybe not react as favorably to advice on vaccines, though, is suggestive that it's maybe something more fundamental about the concept of science rather than a variation of science. If that makes sense. Yeah.
I'm sure when you did all of these meta-analysis of different population groups, if you disregard whether they're Republican or Democrat, and you just ask the basis, to use a quote, what are your feelings about science and scientific method? And you find out after they've answered what their degree of education is. how does that reflect?
Okay, so the question is there some kind of interaction, right? Is there an interaction between partisan identity and education? So that's actually a little bit outside of the scope of this research here. There is some, one of the strongest predictors of whether somebody's a Democrat or not is actually whether they're college educated. So it tends to be the case that Democrats are more likely to be educated. I'm not an expert in this field of research, but what I have briefly gone over is that when people are more educated, it tends to be that they're better able to rationalize their positions rather than they're reaching a quote-unquote better conclusion. And so, for example, if they're educated and they're anti-climate science, then they're just better at arguing against climate science, for example. So, does that answer your question? Oh. Oh, thank you. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
What year did you go up to collect your data, or when did you stop collecting data?
Okay, so the data that we collected
Right.
was they started collecting it
I
on,
know when they started, but when did they finish?
they stopped on May 2021.
So the election cycle didn't occur yet.
I believe Joe Biden took office right at 2020.
Okay, so the current administration, that election hadn't happened yet. And it'd be interesting, and I
Yeah.
wonder if you have collected or know of more data that's a little bit more current. And how
Okay,
it affects
so
your, what research?
more data on, you mean people's behaviors around vaccination or people's
Yeah,
behaviors during the
vaccination
pandemic?
and partisanship.
Yeah, so some of the data that I'm presenting here
Good.
is more recent. For example, this one here goes up to 2022, which is after the pandemic. And this plot here, this one actually ends right before the pandemic, just because I wanted to make the point that it wasn't the pandemic that was causing the polarization,
Right.
but that this is something that has been happening over time. But yeah, so the research shows that the gap between Republican and Democrat in terms of their belief in science has actually increased after the pandemic. It actually more than doubled. Republicans they go from about 14% saying that they generally distrust science. They distrust scientists and their ability to make decisions that are in favor of the public good. They go from 14% to about 38% after the pandemic. And the interesting thing is that Democrats also increase, so they go from about 9% to 13%. But it's just a very different it's a very different jump.
Do you have any statistics on how many Republicans died through the pandemic?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Well, I
As
won't.
opposed to Democrats?
Oh, okay. So the question is, do I have any statistics on how many Republicans died during the pandemic in comparison to how many Democrats died?
Yeah, and I was a Republican probably who wasn't vaccinated. I would imagine they would be more vulnerable to death than
That's right.
Republican who got vaccinated.
Yeah, so that leads into this next slide here. So I do have a plot on that. And so the question is, do we see that Republicans die more often, which you would expect? If it's true that they're less cautious, then we should see that Republicans die more often. But so I just want to make the point that this skepticism of science, it definitely translated into less cautious behavior during the pandemic. And so this is data collected from one of the very early studies in the pandemic that shows that Democrats are generally more cautious in the behavior. So the further to the right here, the more cautious Democrats are in these categories. For example, washing hands more.
How did you determine who was a Republican, who's a Democrat?
How did they?
Some people don't want to reveal their
Yeah.
views because of this climate that's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, how did we determine who was a Republican and who's not? And do you mean that, how did they determine in this study that I'm presenting?
The scientists that were looking at the data, how did they determine it? I mean, because it sounds like things
Yeah.
are, Darwin and I are scientists.
Okay.
And it sounds like there's a lot of variables here.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen.
Yeah, okay, so, the way that we collected, partisan, identity is, I think it's pretty cool, because it tends to be that when you ask somebody about their partisan identity, that you might prime them into answering a certain way, right? So it could be that, you remind somebody that they're a Democrat, and because you remind them that they're a Democrat, then they'll say, I wear masks more often, right? But the way that the data was collected was we didn't ask them about it. The data was, that question was already asked of them long before. And it asked them, what do you identify as? So there's no risk of us priming them. They answered the way that they were gonna answer, regardless of their orientation.
And what states? Was this national?
This was a nationally representative study, and there was some city-specific samples. The city-specific samples were not as useful for this study, however, because it tends to be that a lot of major cities are more predominantly Democrat. And so we needed to look at the nationally representative sample because there's more variation. There was a question here on, if it's true that Republicans are less cautious, then it should be true that, areas that have more Republicans in them are also having higher mortality rates. And so what we did was we took county level census data and mortality data from Johns Hopkins on COVID specifically. And we found that regions where Republicans are the majority also had a higher population adjusted mortality rate compared to places where there were fewer Republicans. And so you'll notice here that not only is the peak taller for Republicans in 2021 and 2022, but it actually comes a little bit sooner than the peak for Democrats and slightly less Democrat areas. And you do see an interesting little spike here in the beginning, and that was because at the beginning of the pandemic, New York was hit especially strongly. And I think that's what you're seeing there is that the cities were hit especially hard, and that's where there was more Democrats. So once we found that, then we felt sort of reassured that we were seeing something that was worth pursuing. And so the next thing that we asked ourselves was, so we're seeing this in the general population level data. Do we also see this in the BICS data, which is our data? And so just to give you all a sense of the magnitude of the relationship here between partisanship and health behaviors, what I'm presenting here are the raw differences between comparative groups and the number of contacts people report in the previous day. And so each bar here represents the subtractive difference between group A and group B. So for example, the red bar here represents the difference between Republican and Democrat contacts. So in this case, what we're seeing is that Republicans are reporting on average about 1.5 more contacts per day throughout the pandemic. And so this gap is actually larger than some of the other categories that a lot of social scientists like to pay attention to, which are gender and race-based differences, and also larger than education-based differences, although not as large as age-based differences, which makes a lot of sense given that the pandemic was more deadly for older people. And when we look at mask usage, we see a very similar pattern. So when participants mentioned that they had any contacts, the follow-up question was whether they wore a mask during that contact. And so here a negative bar indicates a lower percentage of mask usage reported during contacts. And this time the biggest difference is between Republican and Democrat, slightly bigger than the education-based differences, and interestingly larger than the age-based differences, in which we see that younger people are actually more likely to wear a mask throughout the pandemic. I was a little bit surprised by that. So the next question is, okay, so we know that Republicans and Democrats are different, but is there some other factor that might be explaining it? So, you know, what are the differences between Republicans and Democrats that could be explaining the relationship? So what we see is that Democrats tend to be older. As I said, they tend to be less likely to have a college degree. They tend to be more likely to be white, non-Hispanic, a little bit more likely, actually a lot more likely to be male, and they're more likely to be living in a less than metro county, a less urban county. And so that leads us to our research questions, which is, what is the specific relationship between political party and health behaviors during the pandemic? And not just whether Republicans were less or more cautious, or whether they were less cautious and whether Democrats were more cautious, but how much exactly? What's the exact contact rate? Is this relationship real? So is it that other factors could explain it? For example, the fact that Republicans live in rural counties, could that be the reason why we're seeing these differences in behavior? Are partisan differences large? Are they large enough to produce meaningful differences in disease outcomes? Or are they small so that they don't really even matter that much? And how impactful is partisanship for our ability to understand the spread of disease? And so to answer this question, we statistically adjust for differences between Republicans and Democrats. And so we take all these other variables that I had mentioned earlier and we put them into a statistical model. And so think of this as like comparing two groups in a lab experiment where if we could magically make their education levels the same, their local environments the same, and their other factors the same, we then ask, would there still be a difference between these two comparable groups? And so in the following results, I'm going to present on contacts first, and then mask usage, and I'll present two models, one where we add those controls that I just mentioned, and one where we don't. Democrats are always going to be in blue, Republicans in red, and independents in green. And so what we see here on the x-axis are these two models. We see that there's a pretty big gap here between Democrats and Republicans in the number of contacts that they report every day. So this is model 1, where we don't control for any of these factors that I had mentioned. In model 2, we see that the gap shrinks a little bit between Republicans and Democrats. So what this means is that, yes, some of this is explained by the fact that Republicans live in different areas and that they have different ages and gender on average, but there's still a relationship there even when we account for those differences. The same is true for mask usage. In model 1 here, we see that there's a pretty big gap in the percentage of time that Republicans are wearing a mask than Democrats, and it does shrink a little bit, but there's still a pretty big gap between the two. And so what this is telling us is that this is a relationship that goes beyond some of these other factors. And if there's any questions on this, feel free to interrupt. Yeah.
What do you account for the difference in the number of contacts? The Republicans having more contacts than the Democrats. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a difficult question, I think, to answer with this data set. I can only speculate. I think that generally there was maybe less caution within the Republican Party because, as I said, there's a bit of more science skepticism that's been growing within. And this is not to judge. I'm not here to judge Republicans for being a certain way. I'm just describing their behavior and pointing out the implications of it. And so I suspect that that's what's happening, is that there's just more anti-science, more anti-expert sentiment that's happening within the right than the left. Yep.
Okay, you keep saying that it's anti-science.
Yeah.
attitude on the part of the Republicans. During all this time, there was also a lot going on with the government and the stories
Yeah.
that were being told, and how much of that is actually a resistance to the information the government was giving, rather than saying that they don't believe in science.
Yeah, I think those two things are very connected, and I'm not sure if we can really disentangle them,
Yeah.
right?
So
So,
in other words, your study did not look at that.
the study did not specifically look at whether they're associating science with a governmental body.
Okay.
Rather, it's asking them whether they have a trust in science, which a lot of people will associate with a governmental body. So I think there's a lot of things that make it sort of hard to disentangle. Some of what's going on is that, for example, the majority of scientists will tend to lean towards Democrats. It could be something like that
I
happening.
don't know that you've got facts to back that up.
Okay.
So, yeah, so just continue, I'm sorry, I didn't want to.
Yeah.
Totally sidetrack you.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so our next challenge was to incorporate these differences into a disease model. And so what we're trying to do with this disease model is take some of the parameters of COVID and simulate these behaviors that we're observing in the big data that people are reporting. And to be clear, this model is not designed to perfectly replicate reality, but it's kind of a cliche saying in the data science world where no model is meant to be true, but some models are helpful. And so we're producing this model to get some helpful information from it. And so for this, we're going to use a susceptible information recover model that splits people into 3 groups. And then we split each group further into a separate categories based off of whether they're protected or unprotected. In other words, whether they're willing to wear a mask. And so each group is assigned their own force of infection. That's contingent on the probability of infection for this COVID-like virus, and also contingent on how many contacts they have, but also how many contacts they have with a mask, and how many other people they're contacting with that are themselves either wearing a mask or not. So I won't, if there's any questions about this, I can answer it, but I'm just going to keep going. So in this first scenario, what we're doing is we're assuming random mixing. So what we're assuming is that Republicans and Democrats are sort of interacting with each other solely based on the probability that they're in the population. And so what I'm showing here is the incidence curve over time. You see that there's a higher, just like the plot that I had showed earlier with the county level data, there's a steeper curve for Republicans, and it also happens a bit sooner. And the incidence rate for Republicans is actually about 20% higher in this simulated model. And this is based solely on the behaviors that they reported in the BIGS data. One of the things that we don't have, however, and that we couldn't find any research on, is information on partisan homophily. And so homophily is, essentially homophily is the propensity for people to interact with people that are like themselves. So we know how many contacts Republicans are having, but we don't know what percentage of those contacts are with other Republicans and with other Democrats. And so instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to present different scenarios here based off of different levels of homophily. So here's the random mixing scenario. In a scenario where there's an extreme preference for in-group contacts, the Republican incidence actually grows even further, and the gap between Republicans and Democrats grows to be about 50%, 52%. The peak of incidence for Republicans is 52% taller than the peak of incidence for Democrats. And if we assume, I'm sorry, that's 38%. And if we assume a scenario with extreme homophily, that gap grows to about 52%. So in other words, homophily seems to matter a lot for the spread of disease. And there's no data, unfortunately, there's no data on that. So that's a really important area to further study. On a bigger scale, what we're showing here is the same population, but one of these populations is incorporating this these partisan differences. So again, these are the same population. One incorporates partisanship. The one with partisanship is in blue. The one that doesn't include partisanship is in red. And so what happens is that when you include this partisanship, it tends to make it so that the pandemic comes, or this simulated pandemic, comes a bit sooner. It happens about 2 weeks sooner. And so this is actually not a new claim. There's a lot of epidemiologists who have found this. But the takeaway here is that partisan behavior, the difference between partisan behavior is enough to produce meaningful differences in our projected disease, in our projections of disease. And so therefore it's important to incorporate it in your models.
Hi, yeah. The area under the curve is the total number of infections.
Yes.
Is the total area of the two curves the same? They look pretty close.
It's actually, yeah, that's a great question. So the total area would represent, so that would represent the total number of, so the question is the area under the curve about the same for the two curves? One of the curves is coming sooner, but are they actually just the same pandemic? And the question is that they're very similar. The area under the curve is very similar, except for this one is very slightly bigger. And so I'm choosing not to emphasize that one is slightly bigger than the other because it doesn't seem to be a meaningful difference. What I'm emphasizing here is the timing. The timing comes a whole 2 weeks sooner when you incorporate partisanship in the same population. So it's the same data, but it's just adding a little bit more. And so I think that matters when you take into consideration, first, that mortality rates during the pandemic were higher when hospitals were overwhelmed. So there's some research at the University of Texas, for example, that found a 37% increase in mortality risk when hospitals were overwhelmed. The researchers out of the Department of Homeland Security find something very similar. When hospitals are overwhelmed, in their estimation, we see approximately 80,000 excess deaths nationally. And so one of the conclusions is that what we should be doing is trying to manage resources so that when hospitals are overwhelmed over here and there's not one overwhelmed over here, well, let's set up some kind of exchange system so that we can reduce mortality rates. And again, this is what I'm finding is that something like this would primarily actually benefit Republicans, the people that are a little less likely to be cautious during these types of events. And so, just to summarize, yeah.
Again, you're making an assumption based on this one particular epidemic that
Yeah.
that's going to carry over to any other epidemic that might come along. What's your basis for that?
I think that's a fair question. So the question is, we're seeing this behavior in this specific pandemic, right? This empirical data is coming from COVID-19. So why would I assume that Republicans are going to behave the same in another pandemic? Is that your question?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, I think that's a fair question. It's totally. When I look at the longitudinal data of contacts over time, what I found was that the difference between Republican and Democrat is actually smaller during times when the mortality rates are higher. And so what this tells me is that some of this polarization is enabled by the fact that maybe this pandemic was not deadly enough for Republicans to consider serious enough to engage in cautious behavior. And so if there's a future pandemic that is more deadly, then maybe we see less polarization. That's possible. The fact that this behavior extends even pre-pandemic, so vaccination even pre-pandemic, there's a gap between Republican and Democrat there. H1N1, we also saw that there was a gap between the willingness to accept vaccination during that deadly epidemic. The fact that that has been happening over time, to me, tells me that if it happens again, we will see another gap. Possibly, I can't claim that for sure, and I can't claim exactly the way that it will happen.
Okay, so that's your basis for that projection. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, what we find is that partisan differences are large from the data that we collected here, and not easily explainable by demographic and geographic variation. Partisan differences are large enough to produce meaningful gaps in mortality and incidence, and partisan differences are large enough to alter our projections of disease. And so what I would really like people to take away is that even if we disagree that Republicans are less cautious or more cautious, it seems to be that there is variation between Republicans and Democrats in their willingness to engage in cautious behavior during the pandemic. And that's actually turns out to be really important for our ability to project the spread of disease. And so we really need more data. We need more data during these health surveys so that we can be able to understand people's partisan identity, which is increasingly important to people's lives. A lot of people define themselves by their partisan identity. And it's also important to have data on homophily, which I couldn't find any on. And so I hope that what people take away is not a judgment of any kind of group, but more an argument that we really need more data and we need to enable more science on this question because it could save lives.
Very good, thank you.
You know, I appreciate your answer to this gentleman over here because I think that the first question I want to ask you is, are you going to be studying what's happening now? For instance, with the measles vaccine, with all the people where the majority of the people were not vaccinated, and they've also been saying that the majority of the people were Republicans and not Democrats. So,
Yeah.
so I disagree with the fact that you can't judge what might happen in the future because it's been, as you said, it's been happening all along. And to me, that's kind of scary because the people that aren't vaccinated will cause the people sometimes that are. They were talking about if you have 9 people that aren't vaccinated and 1 person that is, then sometimes that 1 person will get sick, even though they're vaccinated.
Right.
Anyway, that was something that I was reading in
Yeah,
the Wall Street
yeah.
Journal.
Yeah.
However, I just think I would just like to ask: are you going to be studying the diseases from COVID forward, as to what are you going to be putting these same measurements on the diseases from COVID forward?
Yeah, so I think, I really appreciate that question because, COVID is a very, particular, disease. And so the argument could be made that a future disease is going to be very different. And so maybe this is not so useful. When you look at some of the mortality patterns in a lot of diseases, there's a pretty almost universal pattern where the younger are less likely to die from that disease. So it looks like something like an exponential curve across the board, across many diseases. And so this pattern here that we see in this disease, what I'm trying to do is communicate that it could be another disease that's very similar to COVID, and it'll matter then as well because we should see a very similar pattern to this. And so part of the argument is more that somebody could take this research and make a conclusion that we need to alter people's behavior. That's not the argument that I'm making. I'm making more an argument about we need to understand people's behavior because that's ultimately going to help us as people that want to help better understand the spread of disease.
But that's also a good thing to do because if you see a pattern, you hope that the people that weren't doing it will see what happened.
Yeah.
That they will then start to do it. You would
Yeah.
hope that.
Yeah.
I have to add a counter argument.
Okay.
Darwin and I were children during COVID. There were lines to get vaccines during COVID.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to get that disease. It was a total, dangerous, scary disease. Living through that as a child and seeing COVID, it's like apples and oranges. I don't
Okay.
think you can go from one to the other, project, the behavior
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah, no,
I agree.
I don't think you can, I don't think you can go back in time to polio and say that, and compare COVID, in part because back then, I mean, I'm making a bit of a
So my
contempt.
point is you can't project the future.
Yeah.
As microbes mutate, you don't know what's coming.
I cannot-
It could be
yeah.
Totally different.
Yeah, that's,
But you're
nobody
not-
can project the
You're
future.
not
yeah.
projecting the future. The
Yeah.
question is, will people change their behavior because of what happened in COVID?
Yeah.
You see that more people were dying
Mhm.
if they took a certain stance.
But if you
Yeah.
look at
Will they
polio,
change their
behavior was
behavior?
totally different.
Yeah,
It's not a matter of difference, it's a matter of if
It had
you.
nothing to do with politics.
so that, so
That's
I don't
not-
wanna.
I'm not talking about.
I don't wanna, I really don't want it to be a debate on, but that's not what I wanna do. So, I just wanna point out that this is a bit of a contemporary argument. I'm not going all the way back to polio. And so if you look at this plot here, it starts in about, the year 2000. And so I had mentioned that before about 2008, there really wasn't a big difference in their willingness to get vaccinated, Republican versus Democrat willingness to get vaccinated. And so then I mentioned that that gap was increasing over time, and that we see that it continues to increase. And so based off of the projection of polarization is getting worse, I believe that we should expect it to continue to get worse based off of the trends and based off of the fact that there's a bigger gap over time and Republicans are less willing to accept that scientists are trustful and behaving in the best interest of the public. Based on the fact that that gap is also increasing, I think that we could continue to see these types of disparities in behavior. But I'm not saying that that's going to happen for sure. I'm saying that it's important for us to understand how Republicans and Democrats are behaving so that we can better understand the spread of disease. And somebody could take it and say, you know, we need to change Republican behavior, we need to alter science so that Republicans will receive it a little bit better. I think that's a worthwhile cause. It's not one that I'm pursuing, but I do think those are worthwhile causes.
Chris, how about just one more question?
Yeah.
On a different note, I feel like what both of you are doing is so important because people don't understand how science works in many ways. And I think a lot of people were alarmed in COVID when they, you know, the original counsel was, don't worry about masks, they're not
Yeah.
like, right, those kind of things. And then, and they call it flip-flopping. And so I'm just wondering if you, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what is it that science and scientists could do to help people, lay people, understand more what science is? Like,
Yeah.
for example, one of my favorite teachers of all ever was a physicist by the name of David Bohm. And he talked about how healthy thought is open to seeing something new and something different.
Yeah.
And the public will often, when that occurs, call it flip-flopping or, see, they change their
Yeah.
minds, they change their minds all the time. And
Yeah.
you know, it just, and then we've got the pharma thing with this, like this Alzheimer's drug that got approved, that should not have, it seems, that we
Yeah.
are hearing in retrospect. So what are people to think? You know, you've got that
Yeah.
money thing in there too,
Yeah.
and so I just wonder how we can work with that. And I know it's not a question you can answer.
Yeah, that's a big
in 10
question. Yeah, that's a
even
big
10
question.
minutes
So
or
the-
We won't ask you, if you don't want to start, you said enough, if you're okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I guess, I think part of what Tucker is doing, I think is important.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of exposing people to, you know, I think there's this view that sort of like public health experts and people that were trying to, I guess, manage the pandemic, or these evil, actors that were maybe trying to make money. In reality, it's people like myself that are just out here, proposing a hypothesis and trying to make a difference in helping things. And sometimes we're wrong, but we're trying to answer questions based off of a testable hypothesis and looking for an answer. And sometimes somebody comes along and tests another hypothesis that is actually a better answer. And that's kind of the way that things work, I think.
Can I make a really quick plug? Understandingscience.edu comes right out of your Augusta institution. It's a UC Berkeley website that's been ongoing now for the past 20 years that helps the general, the purpose of the website is to improve the public understanding of science.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Understandingscience.edu.
Oh, understanding.
Coming out of
Thank you.
And I'm actually, I'm publishing this research as an interactive app. So if somebody is skeptical about the way that I'm running things, everything is published. Anybody can download it. Anybody can alter the parameters and maybe model a future disease that's more deadly, or a scenario where Republicans are slightly more cautious. And I think that's important as well, as make the research transparent and accessible. And so, anyway, I think I've talked enough. So.
Good job.
Our next speaker is Kristy Mualim. She's a researcher and PhD candidate in biology at UC Berkeley. Go Bears! Before coming to Cal, Kristy earned her undergrad degree in biochemistry at McGill University in Montreal. Now she studies how plants adapt to changing climates, working on citizen science campaigns to help at-risk communities, even here in the Bay Area, tackle conservation problems. Please welcome biologist and Wonderfest Science Envoy, Kristy Mualim.
Hello. So I'm Kristy. Thank you so much for coming out here tonight.
So I wanted to start with a question. Raise your hands if you drink coffee in the morning. Okay, me too. And for those who didn't raise your hands, hopefully there's tea or some type of alternative that you guys drink to some degree. Okay, cool. So I have some devastating news for the coffee drinkers. There's been a disease that's been going around called coffee rust that has been affecting a lot of coffee plantations. This has caused really, changes in the coffee beans, and so coffee rust has actually reduced coffee production by like 30 to 70%, which is huge. And I actually came across a study recently where actually a lot of Southeast Asia used to be coffee drinkers because we used to have a lot of coffee plantations, and because of coffee rust, that was really part of the reason why we transitioned to tea, because we weren't able to grow coffee anymore. The sad thing is that coffee rust is not a thing of the past. It is still affecting a lot of coffee, plantations today. So one thing that people have done is to try to, crossbreed different, almost like species of coffees. So this is one coffee species called Robusta that is pest resistant. People have tried crossing it with Arabica, which has high yield and like a really nice flavor content, to actually create a new bean called Catamore that has both the pest resistance, the yield, and also the flavor profile. And this is really one solution that we can think about in terms of still being able to drink, the liquid that we rely on every single day. Now, this isn't only important for things like coffee. So this thing that I really mentioned is called genetic diversity, and it's also important for populations and species worldwide. So why is genetic diversity important? And this is a schematic that I wanted to show you guys to really illustrate this point. So imagine you have a population of trees, and each of these colors just represent like a different mutation that could exist in that population. The one thing I want you to note is that you could have a yellow mutation that allows you to survive pests. something bad could happen to this population of trees, and as a result, certain individuals in this population dies, right? Now, if something like coffee rust happens, genetic diversity is important in ensuring that certain individuals, such as the ones that have this yellow mutation, end up surviving. And so when we think about conservation of different types of species, this is really the thing that we're thinking about. Like, can we maintain high enough genetic diversity that our populations don't die in the event of maybe some type of disease like coffee rust? And so this is really the essence of my work. How do you quantify genetic diversity? So this is data from the World Wildlife Fund. It is called the Living Planet Index, and it basically tries to track trends in population size across 21,000 populations of 5,000 species of just many, many different, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians. And one thing is clear, regardless of whatever continent you look at, there is a general decline in population size. One distinction I really want to make is that population size and genetic diversity are somewhat related, but you could imagine having a population that is not very diverse, but huge, but because you don't have, that yellow mutation, you might not actually survive. And really, instead of looking at population size, maybe the one thing we want to look at is genetic diversity. How diverse are the individuals in our population? And are they actually going to be able to survive any, dramatic change in climate, for example? So one big question has been, you can track population size because it's easy for you to count the number of individuals out in the wild, but how do you actually relate that to how diverse or how resilient your species are going to be? And we know that genetic diversity is really important. There is a United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity that aims to protect some amount of genetic diversity of wild and domesticated species, but we don't have a good sense of what that number should be. And part of the reason is because genetic diversity monitoring and protection is really hard. To be able to collect genetic data, it means you have to go out there and sample different individuals, you have to collect enough samples so that you can get a good representation of the population. And we are, making steps at trying to get at that, but it's going to take a really, really long time. And biodiversity conservation is important today because we're losing a lot of species today. So, one thing that our lab has been trying to do is, can you estimate genetic diversity without collecting genetic diversity data? Or like going out into the wild and actually like sampling individuals. And this is gonna be a method that I'll term the genetic diversity area relationship. So it's pretty simple, and I'll kind of illustrate it through this example. So imagine, again, population of trees, because I'm obsessed with plants. What you can do is across, so imagine this is a species and this is its natural habitat range. You can sample different individuals in this habitat range, and as you sample larger and larger boxes, you can count the number of mutations or genetic diversity that exists. And it turns out that as you sample wider and wider areas, genetic diversity also increases proportionally to area. And it actually follows a parallel relationship. It's linear in log space. But we've been able to basically use empirical data to try to see if this relationship actually holds in the wild. And we find that the genetic diversity relationship actually holds across 20 different species that we have collected genetic data on. So that's really cool. So now we have a method to be able to estimate genetic diversity given we know some type of area, right, of that species. But with every method comes some type of limitation, exactly as Chris mentioned. You can develop as many statistical models as possible, but you are still going to be constrained by something. In this case, having such a clear linear relationship between genetic diversity and area also means that you get really good numbers of genetic diversity, but you really only get an instantaneous snapshot of genetic diversity at that point in time. And this is not super useful when you're thinking about different types of land use or climate change, because if you're interested in a population of trees and something happens to that population of trees, you might be more interested in how genetic diversity actually changes across time. Because when you sample, it might be closer to the midpoint as opposed to, the start. So to be able to protect a species, you need to have a more accurate amount of genetic diversity. And so that's essentially my work. So I am basically trying to answer two questions, which I'm going to share with you the results and what I find. But essentially, I'm trying to figure out, does genetic diversity change in the long term? So as you think about, time. And the second one is, does genetic diversity change across different types of habitat losses that, species in the wild might actually experience? And the way we try to do this is using simulations. So as I've mentioned before, genetic diversity is really hard to collect in the wild. And especially at the time scales that we're looking at, it takes a lot of work. And so a lot of conservation geneticists try to do this through realistic simulations, or as realistic as we can make it. So this is essentially what my simulations look like. These are 5,000 individuals of a single species that are just randomly distributed across a 6x6 grid. And we try to mimic two different realistic processes. So one is age structure. You need to be of a certain age to be able to reproduce, and once you reach a certain age, you will die. And then the other thing is mate choice. So you could, question.
Thank you. When you have latitude and longitude here, that means this is an actual geographical area on the Earth.
Yeah.
About how many square miles? Is this a forest of huge size, or just a small park?
This is a forest of a huge size.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then the other thing we try to control is mate choice. So you can only reproduce with another individual that is, close by, which makes sense. And it's crazy that simulations never really incorporated these two processes before, but we're doing it now. And then two terms I wanted to highlight, because I'm going to bring them up a lot, just so we're on the same page, is I'm going to talk about short term and long term. And short term in this case is the genetic diversity measure immediately after habitat loss. And long term is looking at 20,000 generations after habitat loss. The reason why I use generations here and not years is because depending on the species that you're interested in, the generation time might be different. So for humans, we're about 20 to 30. We're usually like 20 to 30 before we reproduce. And so our generation time is around 20 to 30 years. But if you think about a redwood tree, it's like that generation time is likely going to take a lot longer. And so generations make it comparable across different species. Okay, so on to the first question. Does genetic diversity change in the short term? The way we're going to try to explore this is using range loss simulation. So in that plot that I showed you earlier of that map, I'm going to simulate basically habitat loss from one leading edge. So the dots here show just individuals in space, and any empty spot is where I've essentially extincted that habitat. And then we're going to look at a lot of these graphs, and so I wanted to just orient you guys. X-axis, you're going to have percent of habitat loss. So this is when your habitat is completely gone. And then on the y-axis is percent of genetic diversity. So 100 is the original amount of genetic diversity that a population would have. And so what we find in the short term is that there's a gradual change in the percent of genetic diversity, even at 90% habitat loss, which is kind of surprising. You can lose 90% of your habitat and still have 80% of genetic diversity within the population. And this is immediately right after habitat loss. Yeah.
Can you give us a particular species or group of creatures that you have in mind that exhibits this kind of loss?
So we found that a lot of species tend to kind of follow this trend. It might, so this kind of dip might be less dramatic in the species, in some species or not, but for the most part it follows this trend. It might be maybe like a little higher or a little lower, but in general they tend to follow this.
So whether it's trees or frogs or algae or humans?
Yeah. Especially when you control for the fact that we're looking at generation time and not years, they tend to follow kind of this very similar trend. And then when we look at long-term estimates, which is the big question here, how does this actually change with time? What we find is that there's a huge change in the percent of genetic diversity, especially at 90%. So as you wait, without doing anything to your population, at 90% habitat loss, you might think your population is doing okay with 80% of its genetic diversity still remaining, but with time, that genetic diversity actually ends up dropping to closer to 10%, which is why looking at that temporal component ends up being really important if you're thinking about, a species of interest that you're really interested in conserving. And so why is this important, right? So this is data from the New York Times. It was also data extracted from another group at Yale. But this is following really the habitat loss of a bird called the shining honey creeper. In green is the habitat range, the original habitat range, and in red is the habitat loss that they've observed in 2021. And for this bird, it's been estimated that it's lost more than a third of its home by 2021. And so something we can do with these estimates is y-axis is still your percent genetic diversity. On the x-axis now it's time. What you can do is if you have a sense of how much habitat your species of interest has lost, and you have a good sense of how much time has passed since that habitat loss has occurred in generations, you might be able to get basically a better estimate of genetic diversity for your species of interest. And in general, it's really what you see with the colors representing percent of habitat loss. We see a huge change in the percent of loss of genetic diversity with increasing habitat loss, with the most dramatic being at 90%, where you drop all the way down to 20% with only in 1,000 generations.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You're looking at thousands of generations.
Yeah.
There's going to be genetic drift, whatever you want to call it, at that time.
Yeah.
Your graph is showing that nothing happens.
No, so because this is thousands of generations, so actually this is a better plot to show you. But it's a good point what you're mentioning about genetic drift. This is essentially the genetic drift that occurs. Because once your population has experienced habitat loss, we just leave the population as is. And even in the cases when we do leave the population as is, genetic drift starts to take hold. And once that population reaches equilibrium, you actually notice that the amount of genetic diversity in that population is closer to 10% rather than that 80 that you saw. Mainly because genetic drift takes a really, really long time to occur.
On 20,000 generations, you're going to see it.
Or even earlier, depending on...
Yeah, I don't think I'm understanding your graphs, so thank you.
Oh, okay.
You have another question?
Yeah.
Are there places on Earth for even 10,000 generations there's only been 30% of habitat loss?
Yeah, so there are certain species like insects. A lot of insects really reach like 20,000 generations. People don't really think about insects that much.
Habitat has changed, but maybe not lost. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and as a result, they're also the number of species has changed, and as a result, their genetics are also changing.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this number is less concerning for like trees, for example, that are a little bit more long-lived, right? Because one generation might take thousands of years. But for short-lived species, this number becomes a little bit more concerning and realistic. Yeah.
I think in your next slide, where you show us the honey, there it is, the shining honey creeper. I love maps, and I didn't quite realize that's Central America. I see Guatemala and Honduras. Yeah, Nicaragua. So this population really took a beating.
Yeah, it really did. So this was a really big publication that came out in the New York Times, where they basically collected data of how habitat has shrunk across thousands of species. And they found, for the most part, at least for the ones that they've tracked, a lot of species globally have lost close to 50% of their habitat already. So 30% is really on the more minimal end. Yeah.
What is the cause of habitat loss? Fires, global warming, flooding? Does it make a difference in extinction?
Yeah, there are many different types of really habitat losses. It depends on the species that you're looking at.
Some examples.
Yeah, a lot of them are related to just like different types of land use change. So when you want to, remove a forest to put in a parking lot, or for settlements, when people move into different areas, right, you have to remove habitats to try to build buildings there. Those are the most immediate ones. A lot of the times it could also just be logging. Maybe you just need a lot more resources. There are many different agriculture is also another type of habitat loss that could occur.
What about major fires and stuff?
Major fires as well. That could also, but for trees, what's interesting is that in certain cases, fires could actually help trees regrow. And that's actually one case that could be interesting to look at, that like fire is actually part of the life cycle of a lot of these like huge trees. But yeah, fire is also another one. Yeah.
Would that also apply to humans that are killing the birds or using them for food or whatever? Is that an issue for some of these species?
Yeah. So for a lot of these wild species, a lot of it is more related to like land use changes, but there is a statistic that has shown that a major kind of cause of mortality in birds has been cats, just household cats. Just as we have started having like more pets, a lot of these tiny creatures tend to die because of that, because they'll go out and hunt. So that's one case of behavior change. Yeah.
For the longer-lived insects, is there like a species that has lived for like 10 or 20,000 years, or does the species change after the organism mutates, or I guess that's the question. So like, is there actual species that's 10,000 generations old that we know of? Or?
Yeah, it's kind of like this really highly contentious topic of when does one species become another species? Right. But it does happen in that, like, in the lifespan of 10 to 20,000 generations, you could have developed or like have gained, I guess, so many mutations that you end up becoming really just a different type. And this kind of question actually ends up playing out later on in the slides, but I'll like bring it up again. Yeah. Yeah.
What I've read, the past is cockroaches predate the dinosaurs.
I believe that. Yeah. There's been so many shows about how you could have like a nuclear war and the cockroaches will still survive.
Their nervous system is very highly developed.
Yeah, and I think ferns is also a plant that has probably reached 10 to 20,000 generations just because they were there in like prehistoric times and you still see them now. Yeah. Okay, cool. So, yeah. So the next part of this talk was really talking about, okay, I talked to you about really one case of habitat loss, right? Edge contraction from one leading edge. But even in this example of the shining honey creeper, you can see that habitat loss is not as straightforward as that. It's a little bit more fragmented and more like spread out. And so that really lends itself to the next question of, does genetic diversity change across different types of habitat losses? If I threw in fragmentation, would I expect to see similar trends? And so that was what I tried to do with my simulation. So instead of doing warm edge, let's do fragmentation and see if we get similar genetic diversity estimates. And then looking at really similar graphs to earlier, x-axis percent of habitat loss, y-axis percent of genetic diversity. what we see in habitat fragmentation is that there's a very short-term minimal change in the percent of genetic diversity even at 90% habitat loss. So you can lose 90% of your habitat, and in the case of fragmentation, you can still maintain up to 100% of your genetic diversity, which is incredibly concerning, at least to me, because you could have a species and you think it's okay because it hasn't lost any genetic diversity, even though it has lost 90% of its habitat loss. In the long term, it's a little bit more interesting. So the light green dots are what I see in the long term, and you actually see a long-term increase in the percent of genetic diversity with increasing habitat loss, which is even more mind-boggling, because if you are decreasing the habitat range of the species, why would its genetic diversity actually increase, right? So I wanted to explore this a little bit more. Why is there so much variation, and why are we actually seeing this increase? And so what I wanted to do was look at the point, or the replicate that had, the highest amount of genetic diversity, and the one with the lowest genetic diversity. And because we're in simulation space, we can look at maps. And so every single dot here represents an individual, and then you can see basically how the map has been fragmented. So in blue, you see the map at 10% with 10% habitat loss, and then in orange, you see the map with 90% habitat loss. And you can see in this case, when we compare replicate A, which is this row here, with replicate B, that there's kind of almost some difference at the 90% with the amount of how fragmented a lot of these maps are. You can see that for B, it's a little bit more connected, but for A, it's a little bit more fragmented. And this really comes back to your point of, because we're looking at such long time scales, because our species are, fragmented from each other, they could have acquired mutations that ended up making them more and more different from each other, and maybe in some cases even become different species, which is why when we start comparing individuals in different populations, they end up showing this increase in genetic diversity, even though it might not be reflective of how much habitat they've lost. And the big takeaway of this is,
But there's more genetic diversity across the entire area.
Yes.
But within each little block, there's probably less.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So if something happens to each block, it gets picked off. And if the blocks can't propagate and interact with each other, then it's not really helpful for the survival.
100%. I love that you came to that conclusion, because that was actually what I ended up finding. But yeah, you're totally right. Like, even if you see this increase in genetic diversity, within population genetic diversity is still really low, and so you could end up losing basically individual patches, which at the end is not really good for species survival, because you're still losing little patches of your species that weren't able to adapt. And while in simulation space we can kind of map out what that looks like, the really big conclusion of this is that genetic diversity is harder to measure with more fragmented populations. So you can imagine if you're going out, you might not necessarily know that you're picking an individual from two different populations, even though we can do that, in the simulation. And so as a result, you might come to this conclusion that your species is doing okay, even when it's not. And in some cases, you might see this increase in genetic diversity when you really shouldn't. So how does genetic diversity change across different types of habitat losses? It's really highly dependent on how habitat is lost. And then I had some stuff on range loss simulations with restoration, because a lot of this, genetic diversity is decreasing, a lot of species are going extinct, was a little depressing, and so I was like, what if we restore? But in the interest of time, I won't go over it, but if any of you are interested, happy to discuss. And then for some conclusions, so we find that genetic diversity decreases long after habitat loss, and sometimes it takes, thousands of generations before we actually see that initial decrease. And this could look different depending on what type of species you're looking at. So insects, for example, have a shorter lifespan and might, reach that decrease in genetic diversity a lot quicker than trees, for example, that are longer lived. And genetic diversity loss is really highly dependent on how habitat is lost. And in some cases, measuring genetic diversity might not be able to predict your population adaptation, such as in the case of fragmentation, where you measure genetic diversity, you see an increase, but your species might not actually adapt to a changing climate. And finally, all of this is to say that the nice thing that a lot of you have pointed out is these are long-term estimates, which also means that this is going to take thousands of years for it to occur. And so as a result, a lot of this work is really just like a cautionary tale to say that if we don't really start protecting a lot of our habitats and thinking about biodiversity conservation, a lot of the animals that we see today, we might not see in the future for future generations, my kids, grandkids, things like that, which is really why I started working on this. And finally, I just wanted to thank a lot of people in my lab because this was not a solo effort. I was really new into thinking about conservation genetics, so it was nice getting mentorship from particularly Meishi, Jeff, Clemens, Oliver, and then my advisor, Moy. And this is our lab. And thank you guys for listening.
Speaking of future generations, I'm going to ask Chris to put his headset back on and ask both of our speakers to consider a question of the origin of their interest in their specific science, in demography, in perhaps biochemistry, or population genetics. And what the idea here is that perhaps you have children, grandchildren, friends who want to know, or want to get the kind of inspiration that these two scholars have gotten. Let's hear their story. Maybe, Kristy, can you tell us what got you engaged with science rather in your midlife, in high school, college days?
Yeah, midlife. I think I just had really inspiring teachers. I had a lot of science teachers that were really able to like teach chemistry really well, and it got me very interested. And then my kind of transition into thinking about, you know, plants and like sustainability and like climate change was really after I moved to California, and there were all these wildfires that were happening, and a lot of people were getting affected, and a lot of the biodiversity was also getting affected. And I think I wanted my science to have some type of impact in some way. I know as scientists, that's, you know, a lot of people go into this field really wanting to enact some type of change, and so that was kind of how I got into this type of research. So we'll see, maybe in 50 years it'll matter. But yeah.
Thanks, Kristy. Chris, how about demography? How did you come to demography?
Yeah, so
I think you got to push it forward. That's it. Yeah.
You hear me?
That's it.
Yeah, so demography, it wasn't like I was a kid and I was like, oh, one day I want to be a demographer. You know, it's like, I actually didn't know what demography was until I was in my second year, or my third year actually, of my undergrad. And I've had experiences, for example, where I tell people I'm a demographer, and they're like, oh, that means you make maps. And I'm like, no, that's a cartographer. So it's not like I was, you know, it wasn't like as a kid I wanted to be a demographer, but when I was exposed to it, I found it to be very quantitative, very rigorous. The demographic community is very interested in finding answers regardless of, you know, there's a lot of effort that goes into sort of removing your bias in trying to answer questions. And I know that that's really difficult to do because everybody has a bias. But what I really appreciate about demography is that there is a lot of importance on trying to produce answers that are as true as possible and as according to the scientific method as possible. The other thing is I got really into social networks because when I was younger, I felt like I didn't really fit into a lot of social circles. And so like my way of getting involved in the social world was just to rigorously analyze it as much as I can. And so if I do that, then maybe I somehow kind of belong. Not quite. But that's basically the story of how I got into demography and social networks.
So Kristy has good conversations when the subject is long-term, And Chris, when it's he's at a party short term and he wants to get some argument started. Political demography, yeah, great. Thank you and thank HopMonk. One final round of applause. Thank our speakers.
Good night, all.